So hopefully this will get you awake and excited. This session is going to be a very interesting session. It's going to talk a little bit about product, but we're going to talk mostly about best practices on how do you actually secure SaaS apps and how do you operationalize it within IT itself, right? So we'll cover both those components, and yeah, so that will be the focus of this session. I will do a couple of demos on Prisma SaaS, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. You may not be a customer of Prisma SaaS, and that's okay. You may have other tools, but at least you'll get an idea what to do in the other tools as well, right? So let's go from there. So the goal, as I said, is their SaaS security is important to you. Most of you guys are already using SaaS applications in your environment, most likely, and that's why you're in this session. And so just a quick show of hands, how many of you have a next-gen firewall from us? Hopefully most of you, okay. How many of you have some other solution related to SaaS security? It could be a CASB, it could be a proxy, it could be a DLP solution. How many of you guys are using any one of those other components as well? Perfect. All right, so, and this is the case with most customers. They have our next-gen firewall, they have some other components, and the goal is, all right, how do I put a structure around this to, if I have in IT a goal to secure SaaS apps, what do I need to do, right? All right, so let's go through this. The approach for Palo Alto Networks, and this is if you were purely our customer and not using any of the other tools, this is something that Lee showed on the keynote slide, so this shouldn't be new, but I just wanted to throw it up there. You may not be using all of these components as well, but at least from an approach perspective, the components here that you see are network as a service, which is basically making sure you have a connectivity layer that you can either connect via IPsec, you can connect via reverse proxy, or you can connect via API. Some of you guys may be using proxy, and you can do pack files and things like that as well. And some people even like using GRE tunnels and things like that. So the goal is, how do I get my traffic to a point where I can enforce security? And then you have the security layer on top of that, right? And the security layer has all these different functions that you can turn on and off. And remember, for SaaS security, you need to be in line, and you need to have the API component as part of it, right? So you have to have both components just to make sure you have proper coverage. Otherwise, there will be blind spots, right? So make sure you have both components addressed as you think about SaaS security. And right on the top, you see 3 buckets. And I'm sure you've seen this from us before if you've attended any of our previous Ignites, but I'll just go through it very quickly. There's sanctioned apps, which is apps that you guys pay for, right? So if you have Office 365, Salesforce, these are all licenses as an IT team that you've paid for, and you've also approved within your environment for your users to use. The other side, the other extreme is unsanctioned apps, right? So unsanctioned are high-risk applications. You don't want to see them on your network. Even if you do allow a few of these, you want to have a lot of visibility on how your users are using it. And in the middle is this tolerated bucket, which is kind of a gray area. You're working with maybe a marketing vendor or some other vendors that you work with who you need to allow some level of access as well. So those are 3 buckets, broadly speaking. All right, let's walk through some of the best practices, right? So now the goal here is to have a plan for SaaS security. And all good plans and projects start with 3 things: people, objectives, and milestones, right? So people, for a SaaS security project, I'm sure you guys have already gone through this if you've thought about it. There are multiple teams involved. It's not just the network security team, right? So there's network security involved. There is typically an applications team involved. There's an InfoSec team involved who does a little bit of data governance and setting corporate policies. And then who takes care of all the incidents? So there's a SOC team involved. It expands across all these different environments. And so you need to orchestrate each one of these teams, make them aware of the risks, as well as how to actually do security in this. So it's not an easy task. And a lot of customers that I talk to essentially have still to figure out who owns what component of SaaS security. So it's a tough part to solve, but every customer does it in a unique manner, and that's okay, right? Objectives. The goal is obviously to get to a point where you can either say, hey, my objective is just to have visibility. I don't want to do anything else. Or my objective is to make sure that only certain data types show up in the cloud, right? And so you can define it however you want as a company. And then finally, set milestones, right? Do 30, 60-day, 90-day milestones on what your targets should be. If you want to do a longer-term plan, that's fine. You can do 3, 6 months, 9 months as well. But just make sure you have milestones to track it, right? So these are the basics. Now, the journey itself, right, is 4 steps. You have identify, you have defining, which is basically figuring out corporate policy, figuring out what the enforcement policy would look like, and then actually doing the enforcement would be the 3rd step. And then final step would be to actually automate some of this, to actually make this easy for you so that it's not an additional tool or an additional group of solutions that you're trying to manage. I'll just walk through each one of these steps very quickly, and we'll talk about best practices within each one of these steps. You also see these little icons on the bottom. This actually shows you where you are in the journey. So everyone starts from the identify step, right? That's where you start crawling, and then you go to walking, and then you go to running, right? Your goal is to get to the last phase of this whole journey, right? All right, let's talk about identify. What do you need to know? You need to know what apps are running within your network. So shadow IT problem. You want to know what users are using it. You want to know what about your sanctioned apps? How is it being used? How many users are using it? What type of users are using it? And then you also want to know about the data. You want to know what type of data is out there. You want to know whether it's anything with sensitive information. You want to know if it's financial documents or any personal documents. Some people like to upload their tax documents to their corporate apps. You really want to know all of these things so that you're not violating GDPR or any sort of compliance policies, right? And then finally, not to forget configuration. Remember, your users now have full control on how they want to use their SaaS app. So they can enable and disable settings. They can set a folder to be completely shared. Or if they're using environments like AWS, you can just change the settings on the keys, and they can change the rotation policies on those keys if they want, right? So there's a lot of things people can do, and end users make mistakes. So you want to be able to identify and make sure have visibility into those 3 things, right? From a shadow IT perspective, this is just a couple screenshots from our Prisma SaaS product. If you're using Next-Gen Firewall, you get similar views of what sort of apps are out there. So there's a SaaS usage report in the Next-Gen Firewall. If you haven't tried that, definitely use that. And in PanOS, there's also ACC, or Panorama. There's an ACC console that you can actually have as filter. It's a characteristic filter that says is SaaS, and that whole ACC dashboard will update to just showing you SaaS applications. So there are many ways you can do this. If you have a proxy and you're using a different SaaS security tool, remember all you need to do is forward your Next-Gen Firewall logs or proxy logs over to this SaaS security tool, right? So that will also give you the same level of visibility that you're looking for. But essentially, that is your first step. I want to know all the apps that are out there, and the way you do that is just forwarding your inline device logs over to the solution that you're using, right? Now, what are the questions I'm getting answered here? I'm getting answered, what are the apps out there? Who are the users using these apps? So I want to know how many users are using unsanctioned applications. And then I also want to know what sort of usage. Am I seeing a lot of data going to a personal Dropbox instance? Things like that is also important for you to know as well, right? So these are some of the questions, basic questions you'll want to answer. And some of the best practices as part of this. So now you've got the data about all these apps. Now what do you do with that data? You start tagging the applications. You put each one of them in the 3 buckets that I told you earlier, which is sanctioned, tolerated, and unsanctioned. And you can put them in each one of those buckets, tag those apps, and then you start to build policies around those apps if you want to enforce. So for example, I'm going to block out the risky apps, right? So that could be one example of a policy. The other thing you could do just from an optimization perspective, start to group apps as similar apps. So if I see Dropbox, Google Drive, OneDrive, all being used by our users, maybe I need to have a conversation on why they're using each one of those different Drive applications, and maybe I can start to consolidate them. Same with CRM technologies or any other technologies that they may be using in the cloud. Have a chat with them so that you can start consolidating. Very often you'll see that's a very, very good and powerful way to save costs, because there are teams that are going to be procuring these apps with credit cards, and that allows you to start consolidating into something you control completely, right? So that's really important as well. We do this in Palo Alto Networks, by the way. So we actually have a team called an app rationalization team that goes out there and understands what are our users spending money on, SaaS application that they're procuring. And then they try to consolidate that into an InfoSec-approved application. And that allows you to control your risk. It allows you to control your cost, right? So that's what you'll be doing with this data point that you'll be getting from here, right? Now, I spoke about shadow IT. I spoke about unsanctioned apps. What about your sanctioned apps? Sanctioned apps, you obviously need a lot more granular detail. Not only do you need to know what sort of usage your users are using, but now you need to know what data is out there, what type of data is out there, right? So those are the questions that I want to answer for sanctioned apps. What is the data that's out there? Who are the users accessing this data? Is HR accessing things that they shouldn't access, and things like that? So the type of user is important here as well. And then also the settings that I mentioned earlier, right? So there are configurations that you could have within applications. For example, within SaaS apps, you could actually set up the settings in a way like Exchange Online. If someone changes a forwarding rule, they can set up a forwarding rule to maybe send any email that has a certain subject sent over to the Gmail or Google or Yahoo email address, right? That would be a violation of your policy, most policies that at least I'm aware of, right? So you want to identify those configuration rules as well, because that's not sitting inside a file. That's actually a setting inside the SaaS app, right? What can you do about this data that you're going to gather from your sanction application? So setting up a corporate policy to make sure that any sort of enforcement you do aligns with the corporate policy that you define. Identify those top risky users. Like, for example, in Palo Alto Networks, we do have a dashboard that we look at with the top users with the most exposed files, right? So that'll give me an idea of who are my users that actually have a large amount of data exposed online. And I want to make sure I scrub through that data very quickly. Especially if this is the first time you're using a tool that gives you that level of visibility, start to identify those top users as well. And then start to enforce best practices in terms of, hey, I want to make sure that I maybe disable public sharing on SaaS apps, right? So that way I'm making sure that my users are not making those mistakes of publicly sharing data at all, right? So there are a lot of these best practices that you can enforce. All right, so really quickly, let me show you a demo of how you can do some of these pieces with Prisma SaaS, and then we can go back into the presentation. All right, so what you see here is the dashboard for Prisma SaaS. So once you log in, this is what you get. The typical approach here is when you click on Add a Cloud App, this allows you to essentially make an API connection to the cloud application. This would be your sanctioned applications. So that'll make sure that we authenticate and we find a token, and then we start scanning all the data that is sitting in these sanctioned applications. Once we start scanning, all the data in this dashboard is going to start to populate. And so going back to the questions that I was mentioning earlier, what data is out there, this dashboard is going to give you that high-level view of what data is out there. What are the content types that are out there, color-coded with the exposure. So you can see what's internal, what's external, and what's publicly exposed, right? So you'll get an idea of exposure mapped to the content types, and so that'll give you some visibility into what data is out there. In terms of who your high-risk users are, so there's a nice widget here that actually gives you, show me the users with the most number of files in the cloud, or show me the users that have the most number of public files, and then you have a list of users who you can follow up with and figure out what are these users actually doing. And all of these are basically click-throughs. You can actually drill down into each one of these users and the assets that they have. So if you want to see, hey, show me all the assets that belong to this particular user, you click on that, and that'll take you to the view which has that filter on. And so he has 1,500 files exposed. Let me go have a look at that as well, right? All right. So that gives you the view of what data is out there, right? So this is very critical. So whether you use Prisma SaaS or another tool, make sure you get a tool that has an API connection to your sanctioned apps and that give you that visibility. All right, let's go back to the presentation. All right, so now it's your check against your objectives. Are you actually meeting the objectives that you wanted to meet, right? So quick questions to ask yourself, which is, do you now understand, based on the data you've collected, the user trend data, as well as do you have enough information or data to start to think about building policies to align with your corporate governance policy, right? So this gives you that information. If you don't have answers to these questions, go back to the slides I mentioned earlier and the steps I mentioned earlier and actually go through those steps as well again, right? So try to figure out what answers you don't have and then try to fill those gaps in with either tools that you own or procure tools that you want to fill the gaps with, right? All right, next phase is the define and enforcement phase. This is kind of the previous one was the crawl phase, as I mentioned earlier. This is kind of your walk phase. This is where you're starting to actually getting your hands pretty dirty down into the SaaS application security world. And you start to define policies to start enforcement, right? So I'm going to walk through some really good best practices to do as part of this phase, right? So first, for unsanctioned apps, you could push out just a block page to make sure that high-risk applications are blocked out, and that's fairly good to do. But then there's also this phase, if you don't want to jump to block directly, start to do a more educational approach where you actually put user coaching up front, where you tell the user, hey, you're using Google Drive, but we already have sanctioned OneDrive, so you may want to put your files over there, right? So there are user coaching mechanisms that you can do that are very effective to actually get the users over, right? So that allows you to also prevent tickets from being created on your IT system where people are saying, hey, I can't access this app. But if you do the user coaching right, you won't get those tickets as well. So that really allows you to tune the number of incidents and the tickets that get created. Second, everyone typically has a Gmail personal address, most likely. But then if you're using G Suite, they're both the same cloud, right? So you need to be able to enforce security. Maybe I don't want the user accessing their personal email at work, but I want to allow them to access G Suite, which I've paid for as a sanctioned application, right? So doing enforcement based on what type of domain that they want to use with their email address. For example, if they want to access your companyx.com domain as part of G Suite, you want to allow access, versus if they're going to access Gmail, I'm going to go block it, right? And then the third case is if I have a vendor who has a certain instance of G Suite with a different domain, I may just allow a download, right? So you can do different levels of enforcement within the same application. Same thing applies for Office 365. I don't know how many of you guys saw my talk on Wednesday on Office 365, but I talked about the similar approach for Office 365 as well, right? On tolerated applications, and I mentioned this earlier, you want visibility, but you may also want to do enforcement on granular activities within the application. For example, somebody sends me a Dropbox link from a marketing firm, but I have Dropbox as an unsanctioned application in my environment. If I click on the Dropbox link, it's most likely going to be blocked. But I still want to work with the marketing environment, right? So I really want to set a policy that just maybe allows me to grab the data that somebody is willing to offer me, but then I don't allow them to exfiltrate the data so I can block the upload. So doing this level of granular function, you can do that on the firewall. You can do that in proxies as well that are out there. I want to be careful using the word proxy. I don't know if you saw Nir on stage, but he basically was termed as the proxy killer. But that's why we are typically not allowed to use the word as much as often as we'd like. But a lot of our customers use it, and there's nothing wrong in it. And so that's why we want to make sure we work with all your tools that are out there. Second, BYOD, and this is really important as well. How do you actually provide access to your users from their mobile devices, from their personal laptops, right? So every time a user is coming from one of the mobile devices from a remote location or a different location, you want to do step-up authentication based on location. So if I'm typically at headquarters, I don't need step-up because I know you're within the 4 walls of my building. But the moment I step out, I want to do a step-up auth and actually make sure that I'm doing maybe a second factor of authentication that gets added on top of that as well. So again, something to think about. If you want to allow access to your SaaS apps, which most people do if you're in the cloud, you want to make sure that you have some sort of step-up auth enabled for the specific users. All right, now for sanctioned applications. I'll just roll this out. On data identifiers, now this is really key. This is one of the most important steps for you to know what data is out there, is to very accurately set up your data identifiers. So there will be data identifiers out of the box. Typically, with whatever SaaS security tool you're using, they will ship with dedicated out-of-the-box data identifiers that will be based on generic standards that are out there, right? But you will also have your own custom ones that you may want to add. So make sure you test those out, experiment with a few files, see if they match correctly. Otherwise, you're just going to get a whole bunch of false positives later on. So it's important to test this out in a controlled environment and then have those data identifiers out there. Second, know who the trusted users are and the trusted domains. And that's really important. So if you have acquisitions, if you have companies that are partner companies or sister companies of your parent company, those are all trusted domains. And you want to list out all those domains within your tool as trusted. Otherwise, again, you're going to get a lot of false positives, and all the files will be marked as an external sharing event, right? So if it's shared with a domain that's not marked as trusted, that's going to be treated as, hey, I'm sharing it with somebody external, right? So make sure you define those up front so that we don't have to go and scan all these files and calculate exposure all over again. Do this as almost a step one, right? Third, user notifications. This will help you automate a lot of the incident burden that you have. So for low-risk incidents, you may want the user to fix their own stuff, right? So you don't have to go take in and maybe quarantine and things like that, because it's fairly low risk, and you want to coach the user. So let the user, we call it user-guided remediation, let the user fix the things on their own, right? But for high-risk incidents, you want more admin automated incidents or remediation, right? So the admin can either do it manually on his own, or he can fully automate that so that he doesn't have to go in every day and actually check if there are high-risk incidents out there, right? So you should be able to do that as well. And for things like malware, which I would treat as a high-risk incident, quarantine right away, right? There should be a policy in place that just says, if you see malware out there identified by Wildfire or whatever engine you're using, make sure that it gets quarantined into a folder that the user cannot access, right? So do that very in a quick manner, right? So these are some of the basic things basic considerations, right? On the sanctioned SaaS applications, always do multi-factor auth. Those are your corporate apps. These are apps that contain the crown jewels of your company. So make sure you have multi-factor auth enabled either way, right? As I mentioned earlier, most SaaS applications or collaboration vendors do have a setting that allows you to disable public sharing. So work with the application team that probably owns this application and make sure this is disabled, right? There may be reasons you may not want to do this, but typically this helps reduce your exposure significantly, right? So depending on how you're using the application, try to prevent external sharing or public sharing overall. You can also do external sharing in the sense, I just want to share with one collaborator, one specific collaborator. That's a lot safer than actually creating a link that anyone on the internet can access, right? So there is distinction over there that you may want to handle differently. The third piece here is Office 365, G Suite. Both of these have very large marketplaces, developer marketplaces, and so does Salesforce, and there are all these different SaaS apps. They all have these developer marketplaces. I, as a rogue developer, could put up any app out there which could be probably harvesting data, right? So you want to be careful on what developers you actually allow or what apps you allow in those third-party marketplaces. And the way for you to control this can be done in multiple ways. SaaS apps have controls in place to have approved apps that you can add over there, or you could actually do it within a SaaS security tool where you can whitelist applications that can be allowed. So if a user tries to add another application that's not allowed, that'll get disabled right away, right? So there are multiple ways you can do this as well, right? But this is a really important step to make sure, because these third-party apps, the user is just going to say, hey, just going to give permissions for them to access the data, and the data will be scanned automatically, right? So, and then people just exfiltrate data out of it. All right, again, a quick check on how we are doing. Has my security posture improved? And the way you measure that is typically, am I seeing more incidents? Am I seeing less incidents? How many sensitive files are exposed? How many are not? Right? So you'll be able to track these metrics very easily based on your tool. Second, you also want to see, again, are the users responding to the education or the pop-ups or the captive portals that you're putting out there? Are they responding to the text? And you may want to tweak the text so that if they follow the right process, right? So you'll be able to track incidents, tickets, as well as the exposure, and these are the metrics you would use to actually track some of these. So again, if you don't have the right answers for these two questions, rinse and repeat, right? All right, the last step, automate. Human error is a problem, and this is where most exposures happen. Most data breaches happen because somebody made a mistake, right? And it's not a conscious mistake typically, where they just inadvertently actually expose some files. So this is where automation is very important, where you have to have policies to say, hey, if I see a sensitive file that's publicly exposed, go remove the sharing automatically. I don't want it publicly exposed. That prevents the human error from actually causing a data breach, right? So definitely look at policies that fully automate the full cycle so that you as an admin don't have to sit in and actually review and scrub through incidents to figure out which is high risk. By that time, the data breach is already happening, right? External threats, things like malware. As I mentioned earlier, quarantine them as soon as possible. Have a policy in place that does that. Fully automated, right? You don't have to worry about it. The second piece, next-gen firewall or PAN-OS actually has a feature for phishing, right? So to prevent phishing, which is another problem for SaaS applications, especially if you don't have multi-factor auth enabled, make sure you enable the credential theft protection that PAN-OS has today, right? So that actually checks, are you accessing a phishing website? So we check our database. If you are you submitting valid credentials to this phishing website? And we can block that from happening and making sure those credentials are not being leaked out of the environment, right? So this feature already exists in PAN-OS, so definitely another thing to try. And then finally, malicious insiders. These are your own employees with bad intent, right? So for example, and we see this regularly, salespeople, and I hope there are no one in this audience, the sales guys, every time they quit the company, they're going to take all their contacts, all their potentially codes, their deals that they've made, everything downloaded from Salesforce to the next company so they can restart those relationships and sell them more stuff from the other company, right? So it's important to track that. Sometimes there will be sensitive information in the stuff they download. So you want to be careful on what these people are doing as they download some of the sensitive information, right? So this is just one example. Similarly, you could have someone going to a competitor, downloading data from OneDrive. There will be large amount, there will basically be a spike of download that will show up maybe a day before he's going to give his notice in, right? So those are the things you want to track and have visibility into, so that way you can go back and even potentially investigate some sort of a data leak that has happened. All right, so I wanted to give a very quick demo of how to set up a policy to automate. Let's make sure my session's still active. All right, so just going to a policy tab here, there are 3 types of rules. There's an asset policy, which is almost like a data policy. There's a user activity policy, which is what addresses the insider threat piece that I was talking about. And the third one is a security control policy, which is misconfigurations people do, like setting up a forwarding rule within Exchange Online, right? So let's look at what an asset policy looks like and how you automate stuff there, right? So typically basic stuff, rule name, description, set up a severity. As I said, you may want to handle severity differently. So low severity incidents, maybe user-guided remediation, where I just send an email notification to the user, let them go fix it themselves, and the incident will automatically close, right? So you don't have to worry about it. High severity incidents, I want the admin notified right away, or I would fully automate that to have a complete cycle, and again, the incident gets closed automatically. You can set up different combinations. So I want to say, look for public files and automatically change the sharing and potentially notify the user as well, right? So you, this way, have basically fully automated if someone shares something externally or publicly, right, you would basically remove the sharing automatically. And so the user doesn't have to do anything. The admin doesn't have to do anything. Both of them will be notified that this is being taken care of, right? Similarly, you could also have a policy on malware, where you could quarantine. Let's say I want to do a user quarantine or an admin quarantine. Let's see here. Yeah, so you can have a certain data pattern type that you want to match on and say that, hey, if I see something with an AWS key, make sure you quarantine that file right away, and things like that, right? So you can create an automated quarantine rule as well. So that gives you an idea of how to automate the policies. Same thing you can do in user activity. User activity is more passive, where if you see anomalous activity, I'm going to alert the admin, so to investigate. There's not much you can do because the action's already happened, typically. So that's more for you to have a conversation with that specific user, right? So you can set up rules to do that as well. And there's a malware rule in here somewhere, which will also do so you have the wildfire rule here, which will check files with wildfire across all these different apps. So you're checking against wildfire. and then you can do a quarantine for wildfire specifically, right? So you can set up a rule to automate any malware that you see and put it into a folder. All right. Going back to the presentation. All right, questions to ask. Did that automation actually reduce the number of incidents that you get on a weekly basis? And that's what you'd be tracking. Maybe potentially just graph out all the incidents on a weekly basis, the number of incidents you get every week. And believe me, initially, it'll be in hundreds, and some customers I've seen potentially thousands, right? So your goal is to get that number down to how many open incidents do I have every week, so that you don't have to scrub through all of these incidents, right? And so that's what you want to do with all the automated rules that you set in place. Go back and tweak them if you want to get to a certain goal or a target for your environment. Once you've done this, and you've been past the crawl phase, the walk phase, as well as the run phase, so now you're good and running, you're done, right? I put up this controversial picture in Barcelona. I don't know if you guys know who this is. I hope you guys do know who this is. This is Ronaldo. What? Exactly, I know. This is to wake you guys up. I could have put Messi up there, which would have obviously been better. But there are not many funny pictures of Messi out there, by the way. So Ronaldo's a lot funnier to watch. But anyway, time to celebrate is what I was trying to get to. You basically hit your targets, and it's pretty good task if you get to this stage, right? But you're not done. There are 2-3 other things that you can do. I would call this more advanced use cases, right? So exporting all the activity, all the data, all the information that you gather from your SaaS security tools, and this could be multiple tools, put it into a SIM so you log in one place. That allows you to do forensics very easily, right? So that's a very powerful step. Most of you already are doing this for network security. What I'm trying to suggest is make sure you do it for all the tools that are associated with SaaS security. So that includes DLP, it includes proxy, it includes next-gen firewall, and it could include a CASB that you may already have in your environment, right? So all these things you need to do as well. The other thing that is very interesting is the use of SOAR tools. So I don't know if you guys have started to look into SOAR tools, but Palo Alto Networks made an acquisition of Demisto, which was one of the leading SOAR tools in the market. What they help do is create playbooks. So if I see a combination of this event combined with maybe another user event, what do I do, right? And to automate that playbook to a point where, hey, let me go gather all this other information, let me analyze that information, and then maybe take action as well in an automated manner. So you can create a complete playbook which not only does remediation maybe in a SaaS app, but I may want to quarantine the user in Active Directory and do other things where it talks to 3-4 different other tools and actually takes action in a fully automated manner. And this, again, reduces the burden on you as an admin as well. So definitely look into SOAR tools. There are 2-3 big players out there, but obviously Palo Alto Networks has one of the bigger players as well. You can do custom reporting. This actually helps you send out weekly reports to the right people. As I said, there are multiple teams involved. Making everyone aware what the posture looks like is really important, so you could do that as well. And then finally, for your personal laptops and things like that where you may want to provide access, but you still want visibility into the traffic, that's where you start to use things like SAML proxy, right? And this is a feature that we support as well. There are other vendors out there that do, and they call it reverse proxy. You could do either one of these, right? So what the reverse proxy does is as you log into your enterprise application, like Office 365 or Salesforce or whatever, it would essentially go to the IDP, the identity provider, and once it talks to the identity provider, that's been set up to redirect the traffic or the request back to a next-gen firewall, in our case, and that would, or Prisma Access, anything in line that will allow you to inspect that traffic and make sure that even though I'm accessing from any personal laptop, it's not a corporate managed device, I'm just opening up a browser in potentially my friend's laptop, I would still have full visibility into the traffic that's flowing through to my enterprise apps, right? So that's another really powerful use case. I would point out that there are multiple touch points here to set this up correctly. There's next-gen firewall or whatever inline security tool you have. And then you have to do the setting in IDP. And then you'll have to set up a tool that does the SAML proxy, reverse proxy part as well. So there are multiple touch points. From a troubleshooting perspective, it is a pain. But once you have the flow set up, it works seamlessly, right? So that's something to consider as well. All right, final slide. What are the key takeaways? Block is not always the answer. And that's what I was talking about is the user education piece. So that leads to my second point as well, right? So you may not want to block all the time. And every time you block without informing a user of a policy change, you're just going to end up with more tickets, right? So follow an educational path for your users, train behaviors, and then eventually you'll get to a point where you really want to, you get to a good stable state over time, right? And so it's not like a switch where you go from day to night and everything's good to go, right? So definitely follow our journey and a soft journey for that matter. And then the third piece is automate as much as possible. You guys don't want incident creep, as some admins call it, where every time you onboard a new tool, you're just going to have 1,000 more new incidents to take care of, a whole new tool to manage. So set it up in a way it's fully automated so you don't have to go in and log in every single day, right? So that's the state you want to get to. All right, that's all I had. Any questions? And hope this was useful, just understanding best practice and how to think about SaaS security. Anything I can answer, what we do or what others do or what you may have in your environment that may be helpful for me to help address? Not really, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so inline there are a few pieces. There is from corporate managed devices or if you're at headquarters, right? Then it's easy to do inline because you either have an next-gen firewall on the internet egress or you have a proxy on the internet egress, right? So for inline, you have those pieces anyway for trusted devices. The moment you go to untrusted, that's where the SAML proxy, reverse proxy comes in. And that, again, typically those same devices, you can actually backhaul the traffic. Or if you want to use a more optimized ways where you use Prisma Access or something more cloud delivered, that will allow you to actually have a more optimized traffic path, right? But yeah, so either one choice works typically. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, there was another question here. Not really. Anyone want to talk about Messi or no? All right. Cool. Thanks so much, guys. I'll hang around a little bit if anyone has anything else to talk about. Thanks so much for attending and hope this was useful. Thanks, guys.